So, we're going to start off with how to do a helmet. Now, I've just done the head a little bit bigger than I'd usually do on my people, just because then we're not looking at 5 pixels on the screen. So, the helmets, for the most part, are pretty much the same. The only thing that makes them unique and different throughout the time periods would be the plumes on the top, or feathers I think you'd call them in this age, and the different types of cheek guards. So I would start the helmet just a little bit above the eye line, which I've marked out in the middle of the head, like this. And then we're basically creating a dome, so there's not much to it. You're just putting a little pot on his head. So we now have the bases of practically all Roman helmets. Notice how I haven't actually fully joined these bits up here, because then there would be a little spout that the feathers come out of. So usually it would just come out a little bit like this and then be cut off along the top. And then sometimes, depending on how the feathers are arranged on the top of the helmet, you might even have it come out a little bit like this. It's almost like a mushroom. So now we have kind of like a mushroom cloud on the top. And so where you go from here really is up to you and how you want to draw the feathers on the top. Sometimes they might appear so you'd have like a thick ball of fur and then like 3 feathers coming out of it, something like this. Or you might have something very similar but just less exaggerated, so a smaller pom-pom and then 3 feathers again, but they might just be closer together this time. Sometimes there might not be anything here, or you might get something completely different, so you'd have like almost more of a mane that sort of flows down the back of the helmet instead. So something like this. It all kind of depends on time period, maybe the different kind of legions that you're drawing, or if you're not particularly interested in saying like stupidly historically accurate, then it just depends on your preference. I'm going to go with this style of feathering on the top, but a nice little trick you can do is sometimes the feathers will have little bits missing out of them, like that. So you just sort of make the shape of a triangle going into the feather, like this. Almost like something's bitten out of them. Someone's got a bit peckish. Right, so now we are onto the cheek guards. Now I'm going to move the centre of this person's face over just slightly, just so that I can demonstrate this better a little bit. There we go. So there it is. That's his eye level, and then his nose will be somewhere in there, yeah. So quite early versions of the cheek guard, to my limited understanding. Yeah. The fly just getting in my camera. Right, so early cheek guards, to my understanding, they were quite sharp. So you'd have these sort of quite profound, striking curves that they were made out of. And then you'd fasten them on to the top by two bolts in here. So that's one way you could do it. So that's if you're drawing someone from like the 3rd or 4th century BC. But then later on, the cheek guards sort of get more curvy. It's the only way I can explain them. So instead of having these sharp turns, they're more rounded at the bottom and then rounded in the middle, like this. So this would be more like 200 BC. And then finally, what we can do with the helmet is add like some little detailing just at the bottom of the bit that goes over your cranium. So they'd often have grooves right at the bottom of this bit. So the way we'd start here is we'd have 2 pieces of chainmail that would be over the upper half of his chest, and they'd be cut in the middle and then fastened together by a piece of leather with like brass bolts in it. I'm pretty sure they're brass. So like this, and they'd meet in the middle of his chest, and then you'd have like a U-neck almost, and then the rest is just straight plain chainmail that goes past his waist and then falls down to about where his groin hits, so down about here. I've managed to remind myself why I hate drawing chainmail, and it's because it just takes forever and it makes your hands hurt. But there we go. So if you're drawing people for the Punic Wars, then I'd probably recommend this style of chainmail vest. So this is like 200 BC-ish. So now this is an example of chainmail vest that would be a lot more common and a lot more well known to people that study Romans. So the chainmail vest would go ever so slightly over the start of the shoulder, and then we have these big pieces of chainmail armour that come down into the centre of the chest, and at the bottom they come out like an L almost. It's like this. This would then all be outlined by leather, which would just go on the outside of this, and then usually you'd have 2 bolts, one in each of these funny looking things, and it'd be fastened together by like a piece of metal. Everything always becomes more clear when it's been fine-lined. So now for the actual vest of chainmail, it should only go ever so slightly over the shoulders, and then it kind of dips quite far down below the neck, and everything should just sort of come together, so all the way down below the waist, and then it should meet up sort of at a curve at the bottom. Right, time for my least favourite part. Right, so that's pretty much all I have to say for armour regarding protection of the torso. Now I would like to quickly just look at some leg armour. Now when it came to dishing out armour for your militaries, it was pretty expensive, so what people tended to do was just worry about paying for helmets and then armour for your torsos. Rarely did they buy stuff for protection of the legs, and then you'd get even rarer protection on the arms. But sometimes you would have just one leg greave. So typically in the Punic Wars, you would have a piece of armour, just a piece of metal that would go up to the knee and then to the very bottom of the shin, and then it would typically have like some sort of detailing where you'd have almost like leaf shapes that would just go right to the top like this. Otherwise you might have something different, so you'd have a leg greave that would start at the bottom of the leg, or at the bottom of the shin rather, and then it would protect the calf muscle, and then you'd have almost like a separate piece of metal for the knee, and that would extend out in front of the leg like this. So there is just a couple of very simple examples of leg greaves. Finally, this is the bit that we've probably all been waiting for. Now I am conscious of time. I know the attention span of most people nowadays is about 30 seconds, and this video is now 8 minutes long. But we're going to go through the weapons and shields that the Roman soldiers would have used during the early stages of the Roman army. So we're going to start off with the sword. It was called the gladius. It's a pretty hefty piece of metal. We'd start off with I believe this would be just the hand guard, and it's kind of like a semicircle almost, so it's rounded at the bottom and flat along the top. Now the blade is pretty much as wide as this, and it's quite nice. It's not as annoying and difficult to draw as like most medieval swords. It's just a rectangle, and then at the top you have a sharp triangular point, and then you'd have just a groove of metal that goes all the way down the inside of the blade. Now I can't exactly show this here because this man is holding the weapon, but the handle is pretty simple, but it has like grooves for the knuckles here, and then at the bottom it would have a circular pommel which would just go under the fist, with a little like nut or screw right on the bottom. Just realised I've done the blade way too big, so it's probably only about that tall instead. Now sometimes the gladius would see like a bit of reinforced metal just at the bottom, so if you want you can have this almost like triangle shape of steel at the bottom of the blade, but again, up to you. Now the Roman soldier might also be equipped with a small dagger, so the handle is pretty much the same, so we have a flat top and then a curved bottom for the hand guard. The grip is the same, so we have knuckle grooves and then similar kind of pommel, but then the blade, you'd have again the groove down the middle of the blade, and then the blade sort of starts to come in, goes back out again, and then meets up here. So it's sort of kind of wavy is the best way I can describe it. Right, so now let's look at some spears. The principle of all spears is pretty much the same. You've got a jabby bit on the end of a stick. So I shouldn't really need to explain too much how to do the stick, just two parallel lines that go down to his feet. And then we'll start off with the javelin type spear. This was called the pilum, if I haven't pronounced that wrong. So we have like a ball of steel to begin with. I believe it's steel. And then a large piece of wood that gets smaller towards the top with bolts running down the middle. And the actual spearhead, which I'm running out of camera, would be quite a long, straight piece of metal. And then once you get to the top, you've got your spike, so it should become thicker and then meet at a point. So they were built this way so that when the Romans chucked them at the enemy, these would sort of bend so the enemy couldn't then throw them back. To those of you watching who can't be bothered to do any of that, a more simpler version would be to do just a more simple spearhead. So you have a piece of metal that starts to go in a little bit, like the start of a triangle, but before it meets at the top, it will bend out again, like the dagger does. And then you have almost like a, kind of like a teardrop shape that meets in a nice sharp point, and then you'll have a groove down the middle. So that's a lot more easy for those of you who just want a nicer, more simple spear to give your Roman soldiers. This video has dragged on long enough, but finally we have come to the last thing that I want to show you how to draw in this little Roman drawing video. What Roman soldier would be complete without his famous Scutum shield? And like everything in this video so far, it would come in quite a few different shapes and sizes depending on the era, depending on the role of the soldier, depending on quite a lot of things. So, the early Roman shields, or perhaps the shields during the Punic Wars, so about 200 BC, would sort of be like curved rectangles, somewhere between a rectangle and an oval. So the sides would be curved ever so slightly. Then you get to the top, and then you'd sort of have these curved corners, and then the tops would also be curved, but it's not exactly an oval all the way around. It's really weird to explain. It kind of looks a little bit like a barrel, but then so the tops would be reinforced with a layer of metal, as well as the bottom, and this would be screwed into place. And then right in the middle you would have your boss, which is basically just a circular plate of metal that the hand goes behind on the other side of the shield. If you want just to add that extra level of realism, you can add like little battle marks across your shield to show that people have been like hacking at it throughout the campaign. A more simpler one, I say simpler, it's not really, because I hate drawing circles, but this would be a light infantry shield, and you'd basically have a circular shape. Let's just pretend I drew a perfect circle there. And then the outsides would be reinforced with a thicker piece of metal, typically, like so. And then you'd have a boss right in the middle. This shield is perhaps more commonly known, and it's a bit similar to the first one as well. So again, in terms of the shape, it's almost like a oval rectangle, but the boss in the centre finds itself within a rectangle. But it's not perfect rectangle because the bottom and top are also curved as well. And then you have almost this like reinforced piece of material, this kind of like a cone that goes straight down the middle of the shield. The shield would then have a border going along the outside, and that's pretty much it. So then you're free to put on whatever kind of pattern or detailing you want, like wings for example. So, I hope you found this video helpful in your pursuit to learn how to draw Roman soldiers. In the next video we're going to be looking at more modern Roman soldiers, so more AD oriented rather than BC. But that is pretty much all I have to say about that, so until next time, I still don't have an outro.